Right, thank you for inviting me down to give a talk. Um, your earlier conversation about feminist tea parties and so on, I thought, well, how on earth can I make a contribution to that? But it did strike a chord, and I can link it in desperately with trade union education that I was involved in. I was asked to address the Women's Committee in Freetown in Sierra Leone, which I'll talk a bit about later on. It was all set up very formally and very nicely. And I was introduced as Madam John. So I thought, yeah, an honorary woman, at least, for that particular session. She was terribly embarrassed for introducing me as Madam John, and I should never have worn the dress. But anyway, this began, as often good ideas begin, in the pub, chatting with some old friends, and discovering that a number of us had been involved in international trade union education in lots of different ways. And you know what it's like. You're in the pub or you're having a couple of glasses of wine with friends or whatever, and it seems like a really good idea that we should collect together these stories and the information and so on. And particularly Keith is very prone to telling us that that's a really good idea, we should do something about that. So we then thought, well, okay, let's do something about that. But quite what do we do about that? We weren't too sure. So I actually typed up some ideas, which then seemed to have grown unnervingly into not only a discussion of how the North East became an important centre of trade union and international education, but also, not only that, but also that it was going to be a fascinating talk as well. So keep your fingers crossed for that. I'll do my best. It is an interesting question, how the North East became a centre for trade union and international trade union education. And it always raises like lots of other questions. Did we really? Why did we? Did other parts of the country do exactly the same sort of thing? So there's a lot of questions to be asked, and there's a lot of data to be gathered, I think. And one of the other things that you were saying earlier on before we started was how much is lost, to use that phrase that somebody used. And indeed, I think an enormous amount has been lost in terms of what happened in this region about international trade union education. And I'll try my best to address the questions, but I think it also raises a lot of other questions about trade union education in general, about trade union education in this region, about adult education as well, which you know better than me, has been absolutely devastated, but non-political, so we won't go into why that might have been happening. I'm going to talk about the sort of relatively current period, and one of the other things that I did when I started to think about doing this talk was, well, what period can I talk about? And that inevitably led me to look at my own experience. So we're actually a sort of confined period from 1989 to 2019, but trade unions have been engaged in international education for many, many years before that. And when I was doing some work about trade union education in West Africa, where I was going, I came across a wonderful, so these are my visual aids, okay? So I came across a wonderful book called Labour Problems in West Africa, okay, by a Ruskin College student, lecturer, who went on to do all sorts of adult education activities, and reminded me that really I was going as an agent of British imperialism, because he was certainly an agent of British imperialism. I'm sure, to be fair to him, he wouldn't have seen himself in that way. But I think that's the side that maybe we want to come back to, and you may want to discuss that as well. How much of this that I'm going to be talking about is the Brits going out and educating people around the world? I hope I didn't do that. I hope that's not what happened, but maybe it is. Anyway, I can't do the talk without getting a framework in my head. That's not how I do things. So I thought, well, what are the possible factors that led to an expansion of international trade union education? And then why in this particular region? So I had a look at somebody who Victor will remember, a woman called Janet Hanna. Janet had been and done all sorts of activities with trade unionists around the world, and fortunately she wrote that up in something called the Industrial Tutor, not published now. Sadly, a couple of journals have disappeared. The WEA used to publish a trade union education journal, and the Industrial Tutor was another one of that sort, the Journal of the Society of Industrial Tutors. And Janet started to give me a framework to think about it. So what I'm going to try and do is address 4 key issues, and it's going to be mainly from my point of view, because when I thought about it, I thought, well, who was involved? Me. And so you're going to get a bit of me, and hopefully we're going to get a lot more of you a bit later on. But I thought, why in that period? Why in this region then? And I think I've got four factors: the political context, what I call the institutional context, the financial context. So 1, 2, 3, and then the last one, which I've struggled, but I've just called it luck and links, because actually a lot of what went on in this region, and probably in the rest of the country, is complete luck. We happen to be in the right place at the right time. So I'm going to try and divide my talk up into those areas. So that was my visual aid for Janet. Janet wrote this article in the Industrial Tutor. Right. She suggested there was a political context in the period that I'm talking about, and it begins to when I begin to think back, I thought, yeah, there really was a burgeoning interest in international affairs, internationalism as well, and I still think this is a stunning booklet by the TUC on beating apartheid, and that the front cover is an amazing front cover as well, and it showed that the TUC actually taking an interest in international affairs, not just as jolly trips for full-time officers and so on, which did happen, and maybe you'll see me in that context, hopefully not. But there was a growing awareness of things like apartheid, and also the growing awareness of globalization. It became a cliche. We live in the global economy. People started to look abroad and look at ourselves. We joined the European Economic Community, as then was. Of course, we've since left. That was really important for a small area of international trade union activity, which I want to return to. Actually, being part of the European Union was significant for this region, and I'll come back to that. We started seeing the growth. There was an enormous growth of multinational companies, but we started to become aware of it. We started to become aware of Vickers being a multinational company, Vickers on Tyneside, the workers' report on Vickers, if any of your minds go back to that famous sort of piece of research work that was done, and uncovering all the international connections that Vickers had as a company. And then you go on, and people, so we have people from on shop stewards courses, where do you work? Oh, I work at X. Right, okay, we need to talk about where decisions are made in your company, and they're not made at my workplace. They're not made at the head office in London. They're made in America. They're made in other countries right around the world. So we begin to get a political context for the development of trade union education. And in those days, we actually had, it's non-political talk, obviously, isn't it? But we did have a Labour government that did pass employment protection laws, and maybe a new Labour government that's going to pass, important employment rights, an important employment rights bill. But the legislation that was passed by that Labour government gave us the opportunity to develop education programs. It put money into education programs, and it gave people the right to time off work to attend education programs, which is of major importance. It let people get away from their workplace and come to places, WEA, Newcastle Polytechnic, mainly mainly the technical colleges. A lot of the work for trade union education was done out of Newcastle College and the other colleges regionally. But there was then a political context, an opportunity for people to get involved, get away from their workplace, come and meet people from other workplaces, and find out about trade unionism, trade union issues, and even occasionally to find out about what was going on in other parts of the world. For me, sitting in Newcastle Poly, as was, which became Northumbria University in 1992, the institutional context was an ability to hide, I think, is the best way of putting it. Nobody really cared about trade union education. What on earth was a polytechnic doing teaching trade unionists anyway? For me, I'm sure for all of you around the table, you'd say absolutely they should be doing that. And it was really good to see trade unionists coming through the doors of the polytechnic and then the university. And that made an impact, I think, on the students and on the other students, as it were, to see what's that class going on there. And I remember memorably one evening we had a colleague from South Africa come during the apartheid era, and we all gathered in this classroom, and he opened the meeting by just saying, well, this wouldn't be allowed. And you thought, well, what wouldn't be allowed? He said, this is too many people to meet. You couldn't have a meeting of this size in South Africa today. And I think the impact of just think that, well, couldn't we? And then obviously he told he gave us some more information about South Africa. And then the bit I liked the first bit, but I like the last bit as well, when he says, right, okay, how do you traditionally finish meetings in South Africa? Oh, well, we sing, of course. Come on, English people singing. So we sang as best we could, Nkosi Sikeleli Africa. I mean, some of you might well remember God Bless Africa. Well, we sang, we hummed along, we did our best. But what was the nice thing was that there were students up and down the corridor thinking, what on earth's going on in that room? What's happening there? So that made an impact on me. I'm sure it made an impact on the trade union students sitting in the class. and maybe it made a bit more of an impact outside of the classroom as well. So for me, the institutional context was finding space. I could spend some time on this because now I'm knowing somebody who continues to work in a university, finding space to do the sorts of things they want to do is so much more difficult. I didn't have targets. I didn't have, all the sort of regulations, restrictions, and so on. That he is now, where are your outputs? How many publications have you got? All these sorts of things. Publishing in something like the Industrial Tutor just wouldn't be worth doing because that wouldn't have an impact factor. So I'll stop there because that's a particular hobby horse. But finding space, I think, was really important, particularly for me at a polytechnic when most of the trade union education was going on elsewhere. But not just my institutional context, but what was happening elsewhere inside the trade union movement. There was a growing awareness that we needed to be involved internationally, and there were formed cross-national trade union centres, some with a long history, some more recently formed. One of which, and this is a remarkable part of the North East story, is an international, they were called International Trade Secretariats and then Global Union Federations. And one of them was based in the northeast of England. Maybe contributing later on to, if you pull a book together or whatever, Doug Miller and Steve Grinter, who both worked for the Global Union Federation of Textile, Leather and Garment Workers and so on. And they have some stories to tell about organising in a sector that you can imagine is just an appallingly difficult sector to organise in, with people disappearing off into prison or indeed worse than that. So we have some international trade secretariats, strangely enough, ending up in the northeast. We have national trade union confederations becoming aware, the TUC, and we begin to see the introduction of international education into the curriculum of trade union education in the UK. And again, that was another sort of opportunity for me and others to be involved, and we managed to produce visual aid, a booklet called Common Cause, which was I think, as far as I know, the first sort of education booklet for British trade unionists. I don't know whether you were there, Keith, but I had another shock. I took this to my first course using this and using the material was in Belfast. And we had a pretty rugged flight over as well, with an aeroplane with propellers and things like that. And I sat down and I said, right, okay, everybody, this is going to be really, you're going to enjoy this, while you're here. It's called Common Cause, an education pack for British trade unionists, and we're going to be using this today. And somebody in the group said, no, we're not. I said, well, we are, I mean, what? And he said, well, it's an education pack for British trade unionists. This is Northern Ireland. This is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So this is just for British trade unionists, isn't it? It's not for trade unionists in Northern Ireland. I mean, as often is the case on trade union courses, they are winding me up. Of course, we're going to do it, but it was a really interesting point, and I've never forgotten that point, actually. It's the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So it's not, so using that in a way, in an offhand, I'm now going to claim that I didn't write the title, which I didn't, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. It was my responsibility as much as anybody else's. And I just hadn't thought. Here we are doing a trade union course on international trade unionism, and we can't even get that right. So that was the first intimation of, or integration of international trade union education into the TUC's curriculum. So it was taking off. It was becoming an important area of study, not just discipline procedures, not just health and safety at work, all those things that were very important, but actually thinking about trade unions internationally as well. My third, I must keep an eye on the time, I don't want to send you all to sleep, so I'll keep an eye on the time. My third context was the financial context. How do you do this without money? I mean, I know that's so obvious, but it hadn't, again, it not really occurred to me until I started to think about, well, where was the money coming from to actually run these programs? There was and there was money. This program was run by something called the Commonwealth TUC, which was an organisation that basically got money from the countries like Canada and Australia and us. National trade union confederations were getting money as well. WEA. Somebody in this room is much more able to talk about that than I am. But there was money. There was does the International Federation of WEAs still exist? Anybody? No.
Does the WEA still exist?
There was an International Federation of Workers' Educational Associations, which did a lot of really good work as well, which I was involved in a peripheral way. Ruskin College had its trade union and international research and education group, which is where a former colleague, Janet Hanna, eventually went to work as well. But to return to a point I made earlier, the other major source of funding was the European Union, particularly when the European Union passed its legislation which established European Works Councils. Now, who's heard of European Works Councils? Probably not any of you, or a small number of you. But actually, they were important. They were in large multinational companies, which had sites in 2 or more countries, 1,000 or more employees. I won't bore you with that side, but it meant that trade union delegates from this region could meet with their colleagues in other parts of Europe and exchange information. It wasn't a bargaining organisation, it wasn't set up for that. But what a wonderful opportunity for people to meet from different countries in the same company and exchange information. And if it did no more than that, that was a really important starting point. There were a lot of people. Again, we did some work in this region about European Works Councils in the region. We managed to find 54 European trade union delegates attending European Works Councils in other countries in the region, meeting, making friendships as well. I mean, you know, we think about these, they're quite institutional organizations, but the money was available for training. So the training programs we used to run would be before the European Works Council meeting. So we'd meet, have our training session, everybody would get to know each other, and then the next day they'd have their formal European Works Council meeting with their management. But because they'd had the training and, dare I say, probably gone into the bar as well the night beforehand, they've actually got to know each other. People from wherever they were, from Norway, Italy, France. But I mean, the real difficulties was arranging tea times, dinner times, lunchtimes, whatever, because, I mean, if you're from Spain, you want your dinner at 9 o'clock in the evening. If you're from Norway, you want your dinner at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and so on. So these were the big negotiating points, but, you know, that worked out, and they were an opportunity. I'd really like to do some research now. Somebody gave me some money to find out what has happened to British delegates from European Works Councils, because obviously there is now no entitlement. I mean, who cares? Nobody noticed a tiny little change like that with Brexit. But for some people, that would have been a really important change. They will have missed out on going to meet their fellow trade union delegates in other countries. We ran a lot of those programs from the university, who had noticed us by now. They had noticed what we were doing. So now the question was, how much money did the courses make? So I was not in that position of having to do the negotiations. But if the courses made enough money, then we could continue to run them. Unfortunately, they did. And also the university could then boast a little bit, you know, oh, we do work with businesses, of course, and we, you know, engage with the community, and we also work with trade unions on an international basis as well, you know. So there's a little bit of prestige, I think, for the university there. I'm going to try and shut up shortly. So money. Oh no, the final thing I want to say about the money is it seemed to come from all these different sources, but was I really being funded by the British government as an agent of British imperialism? I went back to that first question, because some of the visits I made were during the Thatcher era. The money must have come from the British government one way or another. Maybe the British government didn't notice at that time what it was funding. The TUC would have been bidding. I think DFID still existed, the Department for International Development still existed in those days. So some of that money would have been channeled through DFID. Some of it from the CIA, some of it, who knows. If you look at the history of labour education, particularly in Africa, it's a Cold War history. It's a competition between the United States and Washington and Moscow, basically. I did some teaching in the Gambia. The Gambia is a tiny little country. If you look at it on the map, you think, why on earth is the Gambia there? And it's either side of the Gambia River, and it's British colonialism. And we said we'll have this bit of land, and it's surrounded by Senegal, which is French colonialism as well. But they had two trade union centres. They had one sponsored by the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, which you can guess is the Western one, and the World Federation of Trade Unions, which was the old Soviet-based trade union centre. So I don't know how many trade unionists they had. I don't know, 10,000 or something like that. I mean, that's a guess, but you know. And they were divided between these two different trade union centres, because trade union education was a political matter in those days. You took people off to Moscow. You took people off to Washington as well. I was never offered any money when I went to Washington, which was very disappointing, really. But and I'm sure British TUC representatives, you know, were on that train as well. Right, but anyway, I'll leave conspiracy theories to others. The last category that I had is just something called luck and links. And I just think that is an important explanatory factor for why the Northeast. And then it's about individuals saying, yeah, I'll do that. Why not? That could be interesting, which happened for a number of us. An old boys network. I was thinking about this as I wrote this. I was thinking about this is a gendered sort of talk in a way. What would be really good if you continue the project and do your work is to find out the women who were engaged. I know the men. I know Janet and one or two other women, but largely I think it was men who got engaged, men who were introduced as Madam John to the Women's Committee. It carried on. There were other courses, there were other course materials. One of this is my last visual aid, because I did some work in Poland as well. I have no idea what this says. I have no idea what this trade union education handbook says. And I did the whole course with an interpreter sat next to me. I mean, why is that happening in a way? It should be being done in Poland by Polish people, but anyway, it wasn't. And so that was the sort of last thing that I did, really, and that was the end of, well, that was retirement and so on for me after that, although some of this work was done after retirement as well. So I think there's a lot of activity. I still don't know why the Northeast in particular, or even if that's true. Maybe Cornwall had an enormous international trade union education program. No, you shouldn't laugh. It might well have done. Cornwall and Devon, but it just seemed to be a coalescence of factors. There was an institutional framework. There was money. There was a political context. All of those things came together in a perfect storm, if you like. That's the phrase we use nowadays, isn't it? A perfect storm. And people were in the right place to seize those opportunities. And then I think once you got involved, then you were asked again. Sierra Leone is a particular country where I looked at my passports the other day to try and see how many times I've been. I'm back and forwards on 9 different occasions to work in Sierra Leone. So part of it is, well, John, you did the first one, you might as well do the second one, and you might as well go back again, because nobody else wants to go. Not quite. It was a difficult place to go at times. So I think that happened. Another piece of luck was the setting up of the European Trade Union College, which a colleague called Jeff Bridgeford, who happened to work at the Polytechnic University, he got the job to run the college. So what did he do? He said, well, where do I go for trade union education support? I'll go back to where I've come from. I'll go back to Newcastle. I'll go back to the Polytechnic, then university. So we ran a lot of programs for the European Trade Union College, again, which has now disappeared. So that's a sort of the outcome of a conversation in a pub, and wouldn't this be a good idea? Yeah, well, okay, I think it would, but I think there's a lot more work to be done in collecting the stories, collecting the information, finding out who was engaged, why they were engaged, what happened. I mean, Keith has a very different story to tell than the story I've been sort of telling, Victor, and maybe others around the table who I don't know will also have stories to tell about their engagement with trade union education, international trade union education. Okay, I'll stop there and leave it to you for questions, points of discussion, disagreements, arguments, whatever you want. Okay, thank you.